Uh, Thank you for three great panels. I was really been quite moved by by all the speakers, and I'm pleased now to introduce the final speaker of the day. So our final speaker is Mike Pillsbury, who is a Freedom House trustee and the director of the Center on Chinese Strategy here at the Hudson Institute. Mike has had a very distinguished career in and out of government, serving in the legislative and executive branches and in the private sector as well. Michael is the author of many books about China, including The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as a Global Superpower. He's happy to give copies to everyone here. No, he's not. But, but he can give you the Amazon account. And he's also written many other reports and articles. Mike is full of lots of ideas, and I hope he'll share some of them with us today. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I've been watching all day long, so I haven't missed a word. All the panels and all the questions and answers. I agree, I think this is correct, I agree with everything said on all the panels by all the panelists. I'm going to criticize them a little bit, but it doesn't mean I don't agree. There have been some really specific ideas put forward. But what is missing, I thought I'd begin with, is how the U.S. Congress plays a role in human rights and democracy, our topic for global democratic promotion. And I think that most of the panelists left that out. I very much Laura Rosenberger's comments, and that's important because I was once a Democrat, but now I'm coming from the Trump forces. Laura was a foreign policy advisor to the Hillary Clinton for America group. She worked for some of the most important people in the Obama administration, including Tony Blinken, who actually is a hero and a pioneer on our new policy toward China and great power competition. So if a Trump person agrees with Laura Rosenberger, that's already good news. Because what's been happening in Congress over the last 30 years or so on protection of human rights and promotion of democracy has been bipartisan. The organizations that have been created were created by large majorities in both the House and the Senate. One of the earliest was the National Endowment for Democracy in 1984 or so. It was very controversial. It had a very small budget. It was opposed by many people. Both Senator Fritz Hollings and Senator Ted Stevens got up and said the Republican Party and the Democratic Party should not have any money to promote foreign policy ideas. So a large part of what the National Endowment for Democracy is today was opposed by both Democrats and Republicans. Eventually they were overcome, and we have the National Endowment for Democracy today with a budget way up 10 times greater than its first year, 10 times greater. Some years National Endowment for Democracy all included is over $150 million, with a significant amount for China. The second institution that was created was also very controversial at the time. You heard from Bei Fong today, I don't know if she's still here. Radio Free Asia was the subject of a piece of legislation that I personally walked around with Democratic staff members to get it passed to create Radio Free Asia. Very similar coalition for the National Endowment for Democracy about 7 years earlier. We were told by Father Bush's administration, I still remember it, Assistant Secretary of State Richard Solomon, himself a China author and expert who had been with Dr. Kissinger, he told us the president will veto Radio Free Asia unless you remove the Mandarin service broadcasts and any broadcast in Tibetan or to the Uyghurs. Now that's pretty serious. Lots of coalitions in Congress would collapse. A moderate Republican like George H.W. Bush, threatened to veto on something. So instead there was a compromise. We created a commission for 1 year to do a report on whether there should be Radio Free Asia or not, and whether it should broadcast in Mandarin and Tibetan. And we got to pick the members of the commission, except for one, and you know the final vote. Except for that one, all the others voted to create Radio Free Asia. Now, we didn't do something we should have, which is create a research unit. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, they had research units. Big staffs, 50 researchers. They published a weekly bulletin. What's going on with Russian politics or East European politics and human rights? But we couldn't get that through at the time. Then there are two more important institutions, which we both heard from today. Caroline Bartholomew is vice chairwoman of an institution, the U.S.-China Commission, it goes for short. It was opposed. It was opposed by significant majorities in the Congress. There should not be a commission which does an annual report for what to do about China and spends money on research and focuses in part on human rights. We got it through eventually, partly as a deal Senator Bob Byrd made, very tough Democratic senator. He said WTO membership for China is not going through unless you create this commission. Well, that was enough. At the same time, Senator Byrd, very smart guy, he said there should be a second commission, the Congressional Executive China Commission. No, the White House said, one commission is enough, $3 million. Senator Byrd said, I repeat, there's no WTO membership for China unless this goes through too. So today, Marco Rubio is the co-chairman. It's a bipartisan commission. It does a lot of research. These structures had to be created because of a concern about China. So where are we today in 2018? The Congress is still active. Congress is still pushing the executive branch on China. But I think that's why today's Joint Freedom House Hudson Institute series of panels points the way forward, because the panelists, especially some of them, are identifying a really important problem. We don't often know when China is funding something or somebody to say something that they might otherwise not have said. We don't know. It gets back to Jonas's idea for a United Front tracker. It gets back to issues of truth in media purchases. There's a whole set of issues that have to be unpacked. And I'm asking myself, as I heard the 3 hours today, who is going to do this? And where I criticize the panelists, you shouldn't say you're going to do it. A lot of you are journalists. Journalists don't actually make things happen. They can cover issues. They can say we need action from Congress to do something, and they can spell it out. But the next step that has to be taken now is to translate these concerns, and I'll list several of them. Jonas and others mentioned protection of the Chinese diaspora to be able to express opinions, have real debates, not be spied on by the local embassy and consulate. How to do that? A second one that was mentioned in part by Sarah and others are this kind of nefarious set of activities that, if you go back to the very beginning, Peter Mattis said, we need to know more about how the Chinese Communist Party and the United Front system, how they actually work. Then there was a third set of ideas. Again, it's Laura Rosenberger. She said, what can we do with our allies and partners? She said there are two things. One, we could share threat indicators. How do we know when something, I hate to use the word nefarious again, but when something needs to be exposed and given sunlight, how do we know when it's going on? A lot of these anecdotes people are telling are not from some serious research survey. They're personal stories. Somebody says, oh, this happened to me. How to do that? Laura also said, besides sharing threat indicators, we need to share best practices of what works in countering either covert or quasi-covert Chinese influence activities. Well, where's the list of what works that can be shared with allies? We're not the only country facing this. As one of our very first speakers said, apparently China has a global approach to influencing nations. Some of Juan Pablo's examples from South America, where they pick very influential people in a specific sector, and then cultivate that person to visit China. And then that person goes back, and his word was very precise. Then they have their own platforms to reach that sector back home in South America. It sounds like he's uncovered some examples of how this is done. So that would begin to have our list of shared best practices in countering Chinese influence. The other area where I was a little bit more concerned, even though I agree, is a Chinese proverb Professor Perry Link's going to help me with. It's been a long time since I was memorizing proverbs, but there's a wonderful Chinese proverb: to be a frog at the bottom of a well and only see the sky above you. Something like Hua Jing Kan Tian, frog in the well. Say it again. So in the well frog, watch the sky. Okay. If you're focused, a lot of people said words along these lines. Well, this should not be law enforcement. This should not be national security. We can't intimidate. We can't have a red scare. We can't scare the students any more than they already are by the Chinese consulate. Well, now, wait a minute. Does that include the U.S. Congress can't be involved in these problems? Seems to me that's a very big mistake. Roughly 80% of Freedom House's budget is U.S. congressionally appropriated funds to states, to democracy, DRL, and to USAID. Lots of human rights activities actually are funded indirectly by congressionally appropriated funds. So I was really scared when people seem to think it's kind of like a moral principle that the U.S. national security, law enforcement, or Congress can't get involved in these issues. We can't protect the Chinese diaspora's human rights and civil liberties alone. We're going to have action by the U.S. government. So that's my concluding thought. You introduced me, Michael, by saying I'm full of ideas. I would have to say, in 100-Year Marathon, I tell the story of how this debate began a long time ago, the debate about what to do about Chinese Communist Party activities. I started in the 60s, but one can start in 1944. There are two brilliant books by a professor with tenure at the Naval Academy, who's a legal immigrant from China. His name is Yu Mao Chun. He got out all the records from World War II and the George Marshall Mission to show how the Chinese Communist Party successfully manipulated the U.S. Embassy, people back in Washington, D.C., and then he shows how it was done against the Marshall Mission in 46, 47. This is fantastic reading. So yes, you're all under 35, you don't care about old people like Perry Link and me, and maybe Michael Abramovich is kind of old too, but you owe it to yourself, ask yourself, could this debate about how to handle the influence operations of the Chinese Communist Party, what if what Dr. Pillsbury says is true? What if it first began in 1944, and it's gone back and forth over who's won and who's lost, but it's an old, old story. And I would maintain our side hasn't done very well up until fairly recently. So yes, I welcome all the new enthusiasm and all the young people who are discovering this just since Xi Jinping took over or just the last couple of years, but I think it goes way back. And while I'm recommending books like the 100-Year Marathon, I recommend Perry Link's first book, The Uses of Literature. It's kind of a diary of his life in China and how he learned to understand what party members really mean when they speak in very strange phrases. So thank you very much. I hope you all agree with me. This has been a fabulous conference. We have a list of sort of action ideas. And frankly, I also want to add, I support Lobsang Sangay coming here to Hudson to speak from this podium because I went to his inauguration in Dharamsala 7 years ago. I was the only American there. But I'm also one of the few Americans who's been inside the United Front Work Department in Beijing. Thank you very much for coming. Jonas, you want to be the one who closes?